It was supposed to be a day unlike any other, coming down to this stretch of the river here to go fishing, but when they got here, it was a shocking sight.
Somewhere along the Illinois River, a fish scientists had already written off as unstoppable started losing ground, and almost nobody noticed until years after it began. By 2007, Asian carp made up 60 to 70% of all fish by weight in the worst-hit stretches of the Illinois River. Every containment barrier slowed nothing. Every harvest program barely dented the trend. The species had stopped acting like an invader and had become the baseline of the ecosystem. Then, around 2018, the numbers that had only ever climbed for 2 decades began sliding downward in specific corridors. No new barrier had gone up, no funding surge had expanded the netting crews, no agency had made a decision that explained it. When researchers finally traced the cause, it led back to a decision made in 2004 that had nothing to do with Asian carp at all. A conservation program built for an entirely different purpose had been quietly fighting the invasion the whole time, without anyone realizing it. The Illinois Natural History Survey has tracked fish populations on the river since 1957, one of the longest-running freshwater monitoring efforts in the country. For most of that history, the data showed a familiar decline of native species. Then, in the 1990s, a new signal overwhelmed everything else. Silver carp and bighead carp, native to river systems in China and eastern Russia, had been imported into American aquaculture ponds in the 1970s to control algae. They were never meant to leave those ponds, but flooding and accidental and deliberate releases in the 90s sent them into the Mississippi Basin and the Illinois River, which connects to the Chicago waterway system and onto Lake Michigan, became one of the main invasion corridors. By 2003, electrofishing surveys in some reaches were pulling over 18 pounds of carp per minute of sampling. By 2007, carp made up more than half the biomass in the hardest-hit sections. So, when the 2017 and 2018 surveys showed a dip in specific corridors, nobody trusted it right away. Dr. James Lamer, a fisheries biologist with the Illinois Natural History Survey, assumed sampling error at first. He reran the numbers. The decline held, a real, measurable, multi-season drop in the one metric that had never moved the other way in over a decade. The commercial harvest data made it stranger still. Netting operations hadn't scaled up enough to explain what the surveys were recording. Something else was killing off young carp before adulthood, and at first, nobody knew what. The answer had been swimming beside the carp all along. In 2019, researchers at Southern Illinois University Carbondale published a multi-year study of the stomach contents of alligator gar collected from the Mississippi and Illinois systems. Alligator gar are the largest freshwater fish native to North America, capable of exceeding 6 feet and 300 pounds, with a lineage stretching back more than 100 million years, a fish that outlived the dinosaurs. Yet by the mid-20th century, it had nearly vanished from its range. State agencies once treated it as a nuisance competing with sport fish, and ran deliberate campaigns of netting, electroshocking, and poisoning against it. By the 1970s, it was gone from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and most of the upper Mississippi Basin. Dr. Solomon David, one of the country's leading alligator gar researchers, had long argued the species deserved recognition as a legitimate ecosystem regulator. His team's stomach content study gave that argument hard evidence. Asian carp turned up repeatedly across multiple collection sites, not as an occasional item, but as a consistent part of the diet. The logic holds up biologically. A full-grown carp moving fast through open water is nearly impossible for most native predators to catch. But a carp in its first year is smaller, slower, and concentrated in exactly the shallow, calm backwaters where alligator gar evolved to ambush prey. Gar don't chase. They hold motionless in cover and let prey come to them, picking off juveniles across an entire spawning season at almost no energy cost. Multiplied across a slowly recovering gar population in connected backwater habitat that becomes a steady, systemic drain on precisely the age group that decides whether a population grows or shrinks. That distinction matters because Asian carp reach breeding age in just 2 to 3 years. If enough juveniles die off across enough consecutive seasons, the adult population stops replacing itself. Commercial harvest mostly removes adults that have already fed, spawned, and reshaped the habitat around them. The damage is already done. Predation on juveniles hits the only stage where long-term change is actually possible. None of this was the plan in 2004, when the Illinois Department of Natural Resources launched a native species restoration effort centered on alligator gar, framed purely around biodiversity and ecological heritage. Nobody in that planning process was thinking about carp. Early releases were modest, a few hundred hatchery-raised juveniles into selected backwater habitat. Breeding the species in captivity is difficult, since fingerling survival is fragile in the first weeks of life, and the Tishomingo National Fish Hatchery in Oklahoma became a key production site. Missouri launched a similar program in 2008. Arkansas and Tennessee followed soon after. Each program answered to a different agency with different goals, and none coordinated with anyone managing Asian carp, which is exactly why it took almost 15 years for anyone to connect the two efforts. Alligator gar grow slowly. Fish stocked in 2004 and 2008 needed roughly 7 to 10 years to reach a size capable of eating carp-sized prey, meaning the predation pressure didn't show up in the data until somewhere between 2014 and 2016, right when the long-term trend lines finally bent. In 2022, researchers at the Columbia Environmental Research Center, part of the U.S. Geological Survey, ran a retrospective analysis cross-referencing gar stocking records against carp population data across overlapping river sections. The correlation held consistently enough across independent datasets to demand an explanation. A biodiversity program had been running a carp suppression operation the entire time without knowing it. But a hard problem sits underneath this success. Alligator gar can live past 95 years, confirmed by counting growth rings in their bony scales, much like a tree. That longevity makes them powerful long-term regulators, but it also creates a painful lag. A gar stock today won't meaningfully suppress carp until roughly the early 2030s, and won't breed on its own until males reach 6 years old and females 11. Meanwhile, the electric barriers on the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, the last line keeping the established carp population out of Lake Michigan, were only ever meant as a stopgap. The Army Corps of Engineers' own 2022 report on the proposed Brandon Road expansion admitted as much. That project, adding water jets, sound deterrents, and bubble barriers, carries a projected federal cost of $858 million and, as of 2023, still wasn't fully funded or built. Caleb Hogue of the University of Winnipeg estimated in 2022 that alligator gar would need meaningful density across several hundred miles of connected habitat before the effect could matter at the scale needed to protect the Great Lakes. Current recovery covers only a fraction of that range. The biological fix runs on decades, the infrastructure fix runs on budget cycles, and Asian carp run on spawning seasons. While federal budgets stalled, a pattern was proving itself at the state level. In 2021, Dr. Dwayne Chapman of the USGS published a comparison of carp trends across several river systems. The steepest declines weren't in the sections with the most harvest pressure or the closest barriers. They were in stretches with the longest unbroken history of large native predators, whether from stocking, natural remnant populations, or backwater habitat that had quietly sheltered predatory fish for decades. One remnant population turned up almost by accident in 2019 when a Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife crew doing a routine survey on the lower Green River pulled up an alligator gar, a species that hadn't been recorded there in modern records, and the lead biologist initially misidentified it. Checking carp numbers for that stretch showed juvenile survival already measurably lower than in comparable sections without GRE. One overlooked population suppressing recruitment entirely on its own. For years, skeptics offered a fair alternative explanation. Maybe the carp hadn't declined, just relocated. Genetics settled it. In 2023, the USGS Environmental DNA Monitoring Program compared water samples from fixed Illinois river stations against archives going back more than a decade. Environmental DNA, genetic material shed through mucus, waste, and scales, lets researchers detect a species without catching a single fish. Between 2015 and 2022, silver carp DNA signals dropped significantly in several lower Illinois river zones, especially backwater corridors where gar restoration had been most active, while DNA signatures from large native predators climbed in those same zones. Fewer carp were shedding genetic material, not harder to find, genuinely fewer. Dr. Wesley Daniel, a molecular ecologist with the program, described the shift as directional rather than noise at a 2024 fisheries workshop. Testing also found reduced juvenile carp signals during peak spawning periods, meaning recruitment itself was breaking down, not just adult distribution. That distinction matters enormously. Removing adults through harvest only dents a population temporarily, since surviving young rebuild it. Only choking off the juvenile pipeline can permanently bend a population's trajectory, and the water itself confirmed that was happening. That shift eventually rippled up the food chain. By 2024, vegetation surveys showed recovery in underwater plant beds that hadn't moved in nearly 20 years. Those beds stabilize sediment and shelter young native fish, and carp had been strangling them for 2 decades by filtering plankton out of the water while stirring up bottom sediment. By 2006, light was struggling to penetrate past 20 centimeters deep in the worst-hit reaches during peak carp years, and native plants couldn't survive. Long-term monitoring, run jointly by the Army Corps of Engineers and the USGS since the early 90s, caught the reversal. Between 2019 and 2023, backwater complexes downstream of Havana, Illinois, the same areas where carp recruitment had weakened and gar presence had grown, showed real, repeatable gains in vegetation density and clearer water. By 2023, juvenile bluegill and largemouth bass, species dependent on that vegetated habitat, were showing up in higher numbers in those same backwaters. This is the shape of what ecologists call a trophic cascade. Fewer surviving carp meant fewer filter feeders, less turbidity, more light, returning plants, and returning habitat for native fish squeezed out for a generation. Dr. Michael Diesterhoft of the Great Lakes Fishery Commission noted in a 2023 review that the pattern matched cascades documented elsewhere after other invasive fish were suppressed. Dr. Michael Drazlik of the Illinois Natural History Survey framed it carefully. Not a return to any historical baseline, but in specific pockets of river, invasive dominance was no longer absolute, a kind of local resilience unmeasurable for over 15 years. Every strand of evidence now points the same direction. The long-term surveys, the genetic testing, the returning vegetation, the accidental discovery in Kentucky. The mechanism isn't really in doubt anymore. What's unresolved is whether the recovery of one ancient, nearly forgotten predator can be pushed fast enough, across enough connected habitat, to matter at the scale the Great Lakes need before the infrastructure meant to hold the line runs out of time. Nobody planned for this fish to become the answer. Nobody coordinated the 2 government programs that made it happen. Nobody ran the projections that would have shown what was quietly building beneath the surface for 15 years of disconnected effort. The river worked it out on its own, long before anyone was watching for it.